Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to tonight's Henry Moore Institute research event. I'm Claire Nadal, Programme Coordinator at the Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you for a very special lecture with Professor Roger Luckhurst, Geoffrey Tillotson Professor of 19th Century Studies at Birkbeck College, which accompanies our current exhibition, The Colour of Anxiety, Race, Sexuality and Disorder in Victorian Sculpture, which is on display at the Institute until the 26th of February. Hopefully some of you will have already had a chance to visit the exhibition, and if you haven't, I do encourage you to visit before the exhibition ends at the end of next week. The Colour of Anxiety is an exhibition that is testimony to the expertise and research interests of its two co-curators, Dr. Nicola Jennings and Dr. Adrian L. Childs. The exhibition examines sculpture exhibited and collected in Britain between 1850 and 1900, focusing on works that introduce colour and new materials into the sculptural process and situating them within the context of the anxiety which often weighed upon Victorian society in the face of social change and scientific advances. Bringing together Nicola's expertise in polychrome sculpture from the Renaissance and early modern period, and Adrienne's work on representations of race and gender in the long 19th century, they have together created a wonderful exhibition that invites us to consider new approaches to the subject of sculpture and colour. Tonight's event is sadly the final event in our series of 3 research events, each exploring different aspects of the exhibition in further depth. Tonight we explore the role of colour in the late Victorian supernatural, focusing on the spirit drawings produced by so-called women mediums in the context of the new sculptural work of the period. And now, without further ado, it's my great pleasure on behalf of the Henry Moore Institute and our two curators to introduce tonight's speaker. Roger Luckhurst is Geoffrey Tillotson Professor of 19th Century Studies at Birkbeck College. He is a specialist in late Victorian literature, Gothic and science fiction literature and film, and the history of the supernatural. He is the author of books on subjects including telepathy, science fiction and trauma, and most recently the book Gothic and Illustrated History, which was published in 2021. And I'd also like to mention here that Roger's Fin de siècle reader volume, co-edited with Sally Ledger, was a particularly formative text for me as an undergraduate student, and has been something that I've constantly referred back to working on this exhibition. So Roger's lecture tonight is entitled, What is the Colour of Heaven? Women, Spiritualism and Art in the Late 19th Century. So I'll now hand over to Roger.
Thanks very much. I'm really delighted to be asked to think really about this exhibition, and trying to connect my work with it has been really interesting, daunting actually. I'm not an art historian, although I have written on photography and fine art here and there, definitely not on sculpture. So I'm going to try and kind of almost riff around the ideas of colour and whiteness, and shifting from whiteness to colour in the supernatural materials that kind of are linked in all kinds of ways in the fin de siècle to this kind of material. So this is also, I should say, a really wild ride. It's full of very, very bizarre things. So do ask me anything that you'd like to in the chat all the way through, and we will pick it up and talk about it. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes. And given that I am so daunted, I'm going to mostly read to some slides. So you've always got something to kind of look at. Okay. Well, if you visited this exhibition, The Colour of Anxiety, you'll know that the transition explored by the curators is the shift from the neoclassical conventions of sculpture and their pristine whiteness to a return to colour that started to occur through the latter half of the 19th century. By the fin de siècle across Europe, and consolidated also in the fashion for Art Deco stylings in the 20th century, experiments in polychromatic arts were starting to emerge everywhere. Now, James Fox, in his recent book, The World According to Colour, something I'm really going to rely on as a really fascinating and useful text. In his book, he argues that the mistaken belief that Greek and Roman sculpture was pure white was integral to the Renaissance rediscovery of the revival of classic sculptural forms. Leonardo banished colour from his ideal of Greek and Roman sculpture, and Johann Winkelmann secured the view that the convention of colourless whiteness ensured the focus on the line and purity of form, and thus made it the highest form of art. Since white is the colour that reflects the most rays of light, Winkelmann said, a beautiful body will be all the more beautiful the whiter it is. Colour then lowered the aesthetic bar, fell away from the pedestal of civilized art. It was associated with the more primitive cultures, the bright colours, say, of Egyptian funerary artifacts and architecture. Colour was from a lesser civilization, lower on the scale of human achievement. Neoclassical masterpieces used the reflective qualities of calcite marble to allow a white that glowed with the translucence, the inner luminosity of skin, of white skin anyway, the implicit apex of the racial hierarchy. And perhaps this reached its height with the work of Gian Lorenzo Bernini and his treatment of white, of the skin in white marble. This belief in the purity of white forms lingered into the 20th century, most notoriously with the damage done to the Parthenon marbles, built in yellow Pentelic stone, yet fiercely scrubbed by restorers in the 1930s in the British Museum, in the pursuit of a thoroughly mistaken ideal of the white marble that needed to be released from beneath dusky brown and yellow pollutants. Now, whiteness of form in sculpture also aligned neatly to the idea of spiritual purity, long coded with Orthodox Christian imagery and resonance. So when I ask the peculiar question I pose in my title, what is the colour of heaven? We surely tend to think of the Christian heaven as dazzling white, pure and uncontaminated, white light, white robes, ascension into the white glare at the end of the corridor towards the pearly gates described in the Revelation of St. John, of St. Peter in his white robes awaiting with our judgment, and we arrive in the hope of entering the land of milk and honey that lies beyond those pearly gates. John Martin's The Plains of Heaven sweeps the eye up beyond the white snowy mountains into the glare of the white sky, the sublime in the service of the heavenly. But as T.J. Clark argues in his study Heaven on Earth, painting also has the chance to evade representing heaven, to circle, if he puts it, around the emptiness of that signifier. Almost inevitably, that non-representation, that impossibility of representing heaven is figured by blankness, a fading into the white clouds or mist or dazzling white light. It figures, therefore, the unknowable. Giotto's angel, which T.J. Clark puts on the front of his book, may emerge above Joachim in the sky of headache blue, as he explores for the first 50 pages of his book, Heaven on Earth. But it's almost as if the angel takes form out of a smudge of white paint that is then shaped into conventional angelic form. Even in a more secular age, a century later, and in a somewhat more ironic mode, heaven is still imagined in black and white, as in the heaven of Powell and Pressburger's film, A Matter of Life and Death, or the world as seen by the angels in Wim Wenders' Wings of Desire. Both of these films, of course, suggest that their black and white heavens or angelic realms are rather monochrome worlds that possess a monotonous institutional absence of colour. David Niven's Air Force pilot arrives in a colourless bureaucracy, an anomaly in heaven's complex and tedious filing system. The sensual human world that lies below, in contrast, blooms in both films in technicolor. In both A Matter of Life and Death and Wings of Desire, angels choose to fall into the world of colour, of human passion and the tragedies of history, of time and love and death. Just to bring this up to date, even in the brash colours of the afterlife as imagined in the TV series The Good Place, there is a trope of the white void from which all figuration seems to come. And in the Manichaean vision of David Lynch's Twin Peaks, the Black Lodge is always paired with its other, rarely seen, White Lodge. So, winding back to the beginning, the assumption of the whiteness of classical statuary was, of course, a mistake, an error that was beginning to be corrected by art historians from the beginning of the 19th century. The term polychromy, or the use of multiple colours, was coined by A.C. Quatremer de Quincy in his 1814 book, Le Jupiter Olympien, which audaciously imagined the original colouring used by the Greeks on their statues. Archaeological research was equally revealing on a systematic level that both the Greeks and Romans favoured painting in colour their statues. The white classical and neoclassical ideal was slowly being displaced. John Ruskin brought the polychromy of the stones of Venice into British architecture really influentially throughout the mid-19th century period. And Owen Jones sketched out a revolution in decorative colour in his equally influential The Grammar of Ornament, praising the patterns of Islamic and Eastern art. This was not a done deal, however. The purity of the white cube, the white abstracted space for art, remained essential to some modernist movements in the early 20th century. Theo van Doesburg's statement of principles in his 1929 declaration towards white painting declares that, to quote him, white is the spiritual colour of our times, the clearness of which directs all our actions. This is the colour of modern times, the colour which dissipates a whole era. Our era is one of perfection, purity, and certitude. We have superseded both the brown of decadence and classicism and the blue of divisionism, the cult of the blue sky, the gods with green beards and the spectrum. White, pure white. And for the architect Le Corbusier, white walls erased not just the nightmare burden of history, but also all the old gods and the votive offerings, as he put it, that cluttered up bourgeois domestic spaces in the 19th century. On white, rippling walls, Le Corbusier said, these accretions of dead things from the past would be intolerable. They would leave a mark. Weirdly, the spiritual colour for Van Doesburg is exactly the trace of the old religion that Le Corbusier's white walls seek to expel. So there's some kind of odd disturbance going on here about the traditional link of whiteness and the colour of spirit or the colour of heaven. So what I'm going to explore in this talk is how the colour of heaven, of spirit and spirituality and representations in art also came into focus in a new way towards the end of the 19th century in the spheres of occultism, spiritualism, and psychical research, in an odd parallel that follows, in a sense, this return to colour in sculpture. Now, I'm not going to be impudent enough to suggest any intrinsic link between these things, although there might be some in specific cases. Mostly, I just want to bring forward this peculiar parallel and invite you to think about possible connections between fine art in the gallery and the world of the occult or heterodox belief systems in the same cultural moment. My question, what is the colour of heaven, is designed to echo the title of a work by the anthropologist Michael Taussig, which he published in 2009 in a book which you can just about see the title of here, I hope, called What is the Colour of the Sacred? This enigmatic question was borrowed in turn by Taussig from the surrealist writer and anthropologist Michel Leiris. Leiris had given a talk to the College of Sociology, that group of renegade surrealists, not spiritualists, in the 1930s, in which he proposed to explore the sacred in everyday life. Leiris chose not to talk about religion or spirituality or the worlds of religious belief he had researched as an anthropological field worker in the 1920s in West Africa, but instead, in this short essay, he evoked intensely personal feelings of sacred awe, fear, sublimity, or terror that he took from his own childhood memories. The strange rituals, the personal sacred spaces, fetish objects, and elevated feelings that he had experienced as a child. And Leiris ends this lecture with a short paragraph, which I've just got up on the screen here, which I'll read to you. If one of the most sacred aims that a man can set for himself is to acquire as exact and intense an understanding of himself as possible, it seems desirable that each one of us, scrutinizing his memories with the greatest possible honesty, examine whether he can discover some sign permitting him to discern the colour for him of the very notion of the sacred. So the colour for him of the very notion of the sacred. Michael Taussig takes up this surrealist question of the colour of the sacred in the frame of modern anthropology. He suggests that Western cultures have tended to associate colour with primitive cultures, that the elevation of whiteness comes with a certain kind of chromophobia, or fear of bright colours. Civilized nations and civilized people have long felt strange about colour, Taussig suggests, and adds, colour for the West became attached to coloured people or their equivalents. Bright colours are then outre, transgressive, primitive, savage, uncivilized. Women, children, and savages, always thought together in the late Victorian period, are distracted and delighted by bright colours, in contrast to the dull white men in their black coats and drab suits who never venture beyond the pale, except in very prescribed moments of licensed transgression, the odd loud tie perhaps framed by a sober suit. Bright colour gets tied to primitive belief or uncivilized taste. And maybe this is why polychromy was still frowned upon in some quarters, that late 19th century experiments in colour in sculpture or other decorative arts remain of somewhat dubious or questionable taste, or bound within strict historical limits and contexts. So the question I pose is, what is the colour of the sacred in the heterodox or occult cultures of the 19th century? And perhaps the most famous and influential instance of the reflection on colour by those interested in secret, sacred, or occult knowledge was the book, a very strange book, called Thought Forms, published by Annie Besant and C.W. Ledbetter in 1905. And here is the frontispiece of that book. Now, Annie Besant was the political radical and socialist and strike leader who had converted very suddenly to theosophy in the late 1880s, much to the shock of her political friends. The Theosophical Society was an esoteric movement set up by the Russian mystic and pathological liar Helena Blavatsky in 1875. Blavatsky claimed to have been given access to a secret hermetic body of knowledge, which she published in her magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine, which synthesized not only all the religions of the world, East and West, but also fused theology and science into one grand universal theory of syncretic knowledge. Adepts of theosophy were given access to the wisdom of the ancients by the spiritual training in the ability to read in signs or messages from beyond mundane reality, to penetrate the dull exoteric world, to find the esoteric secret hidden within it, and to reach states where mental travel through astral spheres became possible. The occult exercise of theosophy borrowed a lot from the ritual magic revival of grades and rituals and hierarchies that initiates had to pass through, and also from some aspects of spiritualism, although Blavatsky vigorously distinguished her own practice from that of lowly and foolish spiritualist mediums. Theosophical writing was also wrapped up in the language of science for added legitimacy, but also because stunning breakthroughs by physicists were contemporaneously opening up magical worlds beyond the narrow visible spectrum apprehended by the unaided human eye. So, William Crookes, the English chemist, discovered what he called dark matter in the 1870s, beams of invisible radiation that seemed to pass through his vacuum tubes. They're still called Crookes tubes. Heinrich Hertz built devices that detected wavelengths that were the basis for the emergence of wireless telegraphy in the 1890s, that magical technology of action at a distance that amazed the world. And Wilhelm Röntgen in 1895 shot to global fame when he published his photographs that recorded the effects of a newly detected band of electromagnetic wavelengths that he called X-rays. Upon seeing the bones of her own hand in one of the first ever X-ray photographs, Röntgen's wife, Anna, declared, "I have seen my own death." Nearly all of these technologies at the end of the 19th century were about detecting new wavelengths, new visionary spaces, and they also produced a strange occult double or shadow wherever they fell. It was as if the natural seamlessly merged into the supernatural in these magical devices. Indeed, the metaphor of the spectrum was suddenly everywhere in writings about extreme states of consciousness or the occult. Frederick Myers, who was a psychologist and founder of the Psychical Research Society, developed a whole spectrum theory of consciousness, where apparently supernatural abilities were merely instances of momentary access to capacities beyond the normal spectrum of mind. Ghosts became, in this new science of psychical research, little more than spectres of the spectrum. William Crookes was knighted for his services to chemistry and physics, but he also published his findings in this notorious book, Researchers in the Phenomena of Spiritualism, and found, using the very same scientific equipment, that he had detected what he thought was an entirely new force or energy in the world, emitted by mediums during spiritualist seances, an energy that he called psychic force. He nearly lost his scientific reputation over these claims and soon learnt to keep his views much more private. He abandoned public affirmations of his belief in spiritualism and later joined the Ghost Club in the 1890s, where he could pursue his investigations amongst gentlemen who could be trusted to keep a secret. Another pioneer of this invisible spectrum, a visionary surfer of the Hertzian waves, was Sir Oliver Lodge, who also became one of the most important psychical researchers of the era, particularly after 1916, when he published his best-selling account, this was in the middle of the First World War, of course, of his conversations with his dead son, who had been killed at the front in 1915. In the early years of the BBC in the 1920s, Oliver Lodge used the new mass medium of radio to conduct large-scale experiments on whether telepathic powers might be found to lurk somewhere in the spectrum of the new radio wave. And as devices multiplied for detecting waves across the spectrum, it was possible to think of those in the higher range as ultraviolet, as heavenly, and those in the lower range of the infrared as lowly and hellish. So, to go back to thought forms, Besant and Leadbetter were thinking in a similar kind of mode. They argued that training in the discipline of theosophy could reveal the vivid colours of the invisible spectrum. They listed the breakthroughs of X-rays, the work of Marie and Pierre Curie on radium and radiation, but these marvellous discoveries were all mixed up with hypnotism, telepathy, clairvoyance, and telekinesis, all those claims of psychical researchers, mesmeric healers, mystics, ritual magicians, spiritualists, and occultists. For Besant and Leadbetter, adepts of theosophy could be trained to render the colours of human thoughts or the colour of human emotions. Emotional changes, they explain helpfully in their foreword to thought forms, show their nature by changes in colour in the cloud-like ovoid or aura that encompasses all living beings. This aura was nothing less than the radiating ethereal vibrations that the trained mind could learn to detect beyond the limited capacities of the 5 human senses. The nature of your thought, they said, determined its form. The quality of the thought, though, determined its colour. The range they explored in thought forms went all the way from inchoate, abstract clouds to precise forms and moved through the ranges of colour exactly as they were laid out on the spectrum. They asked artist friends to render versions of these thought forms, although they acknowledged that, to quote them, to paint in Earth's dull colours the forms clothed in the living light of other worlds is a hard and thankful task. Nevertheless, they had a go. The thought envisaged by Besant and Leadbetter, in fact, followed the scientific spectrum from the longer wavelengths of the muddy reds of the infrared part of the spectrum, the place of lowly, grasping animal passions, through the blues of higher devotional thoughts to the apex of spiritual thought placed somewhere in the ultraviolet range. In the extraordinary colour plates for the book, a pink cloud can be one of marking pure affection, while another, tinged more blue, is a vaguely pleasurable religious feeling, a sensation of devoutness. Later on in the book, the forms get more elaborate and precise. One shows 2 thought forms that were exhibited at the same funeral by 2 different mourners. The first form, as you can see, is an inchoate shape of fear and depression at the thought of death. But the other, illustrating the virtues of theosophical training, is a precise form that moves from lowly colours, so the greens and reds, towards an apex of violet and shooting golden stars. From this book, we can discover very precisely what the colour of heaven might be. It is not the traditional white. Beyond the visible spectrum, heading towards the ultraviolet, heaven seems to be largely purple. All of this, no doubt, feels very marginal and eccentric, but the book's accidental embrace of abstract, non-representational painting proved very influential on several figures in the emergent practice of what soon became shaped into modernist art. The impact, for example, on Vasily Kandinsky's practice was made explicit in his 1912 essay on the spiritual in art, where his understanding of colour as possessing spiritual vibration is overtly borrowed from theosophical teaching. Literature, music, and art, Kandinsky claimed, are the first sensitive spheres in which this spiritual revolution makes itself felt in the form of reality. His private language of abstract shapes and colours was a form of what he called chromotherapy, colour therapy, which was directly borrowed from the taxonomy of colour laid out in thought forms. There was the impact too on the colour codings and symbolism of Piet Mondrian, who joined the Dutch section of Theosophists in 1909. And the recent surge of interest around early abstract painting of the Swedish artist Hilma af Klint also needs to grasp this context as central to her use of figures and colour. Hilma af Klint moved through a spiritualist phase after the death of her sister in the early 1880s, before meeting Rudolf Steiner, the mystic whose anthroposophy, can never say that word, was heavily influenced by Blavatsky and Theosophy as well. In thought forms, Besant and Ledbetter refer to the ability of the camera shutter to capture forms otherwise invisible to the naked eye. And they reference a book of the French medic Dr. Hippolyte Baraduc, who claimed to have captured on film soul forms in his book, The Human Soul, came out in 1896. Later, this image is from later, Baraduc photographed the soul departing from his son's body on his deathbed in 1909, and succeeded again in the following year with a similar image captured of his wife's departing soul, this time caught gathering and collecting above the body 20 minutes after her physical death. Now, the spiritualist movement emerged 60 years earlier, in the revolutionary year of 1848. And at first, it modelled its imperfect and indirect messages from the afterlife on the new telegraph system. The dead rapped out their messages from beyond, just like Morse code operators did, on flimsy wires. Some mediums adopted photography in the 1870s as another evidential tool, since the camera might detect the presence of spirits that the naked human eye could not detect. These spectral presences emerged out of the chemical emulsion of the photographic plate, and they became known as extras, spirit extras. Blobs and blebs of light on images were later called orbs, interpreted not as processing errors, but as obtrusions or attempted obtrusions from other dimensions into our visible world, something that the eye could not capture, but the camera, the speed of the shutter, might be able to capture. Mediums could be conceptualized as sensitive photographic plates whose special dispensation allowed communications to develop out of their own peculiar chemistry. The afterlife, as conceived among spiritualists, contained no punitive vision of hell, only a place of continual spiritual progression, an afterlife of unending evolution towards perfection in a bright and sunny place, a heaven that was often referred to, called Summerland. Summerland was idyllic, pastoral, bursting with bright light of posthumous enlightenment of its newly arrived souls. Consequently, the spirits who were captured on film were very conventionally shrouded in white, like all the good old-fashioned ghosts who appear in their grave cerements. When in the 1870s, mediums began to materialize physical presences of spirits in the dark seance, these white visitants even glowed slightly, appearing with an otherworldly phosphorescence in the dark. The researchers of the chemist William Crookes famously included photographs of the spirit of Katie King, a glowing material presence in his laboratory in Mornington Crescent in London. The spirit of Katie King took Crookes's arm and sedately paraded around the laboratory, while the young medium who produced her, Florence Cook, was bound to her chair in a cabinet in another room beyond the curtains. To secure against any possibility of fraud, Crookes even hooked Florence Cook into electrical circuits to detect any movement or break in the circuit. In the early 20th century, spiritualist mediums even developed sculptural abilities with the emergence of what became known as ectoplasm, the otherworldly ethereal matter that was extruded from the medium's weirdly plastic body, which could then be shaped into different spirit forms. This was particularly associated with women mediums, who were always considered to have more finely tuned nervous systems than men, and in the matter of ectoplasmic extrusions, a much more protean, malleable, and abject body. Once again, these ectoplasmic sculptures tended to be white. The spiritualist heaven in these representations draws on the most benign dissenting associations of heaven with spiritual enlightenment and bright white light. But actually, as Mark Demarest, a historian of spiritualism and psychical research, pointed out to me when I asked him the question, what is the colour of spiritualist heaven? He pointed out to me that many spiritualist seances seeking photographic evidence of revenants from the afterlife actually turned the seance room into a literal dark room by bathing the space in low-frequency red light. Red light, some mediums and psychical researchers argued, meant less interference with the manifestation of spirits because of its lower etheric vibrations. Bright white light might disturb or prevent spiritual phenomena, or indeed threaten to damage the sensitive nerves of the medium. White light was also the pitiless enemy of tricks and sleights of hand used by some mediums. So at the height of the spiritualist movement from the 1870s to the 1920s, many seances were bathed in red light. Now, this actually echoes the recent work of the very remarkable photographer Shannon Taggart in her book of contemporary photographs that came out in 2019, which were taken in the Lily Vale spiritualist community in upstate New York. So it's the only surviving spiritualist community, kind of utopian settlement that still exists. The book Seance is a record of the seances she attended while living in the community. Reds and purples predominate, heavily saturating the visual field, perhaps an echo of the thought forms examined by Annie Besant and Ledbetter over a century before. Let me conclude, though, this eccentric tour of the colour of heaven with the vision of two pioneering women artists I'll just deal with very quickly. Both of these artists were displaced from the public realm of fine art, but ended up redirecting their talents into spiritualistic mediumship. where in trance states they developed remarkable capacities to draw symbolic visions of heaven or the afterlife. So Anna Howitt was the daughter of progressive writers and leading dissenting spiritualists William and Mary Howitt, very well known in the 19th century. Anna had been prodigiously talented as an illustrator and artist from a very young age, illustrating published works in her early years in the 1850s. She had exhibited at the Royal Academy, but abandoned her career as a painter after caustic criticism from the words of John Ruskin, who laid into her paintings in his typically intemperate way. She was part of the family seance circle of the Howitts, however, and from her earliest years began to develop spiritualist medium capacities of her own. Her parents were connected to the Bohemian circles around the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, where William Michael Rossetti was most active in arranging and conducting seances. There is much scholarship, a lot of scholarship, devoted to whether Dante Gabriel Rossetti's attempts to contact the spirit of Elizabeth Siddal, his muse, makes his most famous portrait of her as Beatrice a spiritualist painting. Amongst this group, and after marriage leading to the leading spiritualist and mystic A.A. Watts, Anna Howitt developed her own powers, and this became space for her art to return, often highly symbolic drawings, usually executed by her automatic hand when she had fallen into dissociated trance states. They were first published to illustrate an account of spiritualism, which I think very significantly was called Light in the Valley. Howitt later reflected, and this is a quote from her, "The first drawings were very crude indeed, like the uncertain tottering lines of a child, and also singularly resembling the designs of very early Italian painters, heads of Christ, angels, curious female figures seated within spheres and hearts, and always these drawings were accompanied with strange ornaments of spiral and shell forms with dots and scroll-like ciphers, which I thought odd at the time, but only months afterwards, when accidentally referring back to them, discovered them to be the first undeveloped attempts at writing in one of the spirit languages." So she's finding not only the colour, but also the language of heaven. Anna Howitt opened a path for other female mediums who worked in spirit drawing forms. And I'll just mention one of the most famous, her friend Georgiana Houghton. Houghton claimed to fall into trance states and be guided in her automatic drawings by several spirit guides, including, interestingly, one from the Italian Renaissance, the painter Antonio da Correggio. These spirit drawings were exhibited in London in her only public exhibition in 1871, to, it must be said, a fair degree of puzzlement. Houghton later wrote a lengthy account of her spiritualist experiences called Evenings at Home in Spiritualist Seance, in which she talks about the colour coding and the symbolism of her spirit drawings, where yellow, red, and blue track faith, hope, and charity, and where her spiraling forms take the shape of soul flowers, as she puts it, that spring up in the spirit realm, with each human soul on earth matched in spirit with the colour and form of a paired floral emblem. Later, she also began to draw spiritual crowns, explaining helpfully, "Every thought, word, and deed bears spiritual fruit, and while emanating from the human being is accompanied by a radiant line of colour, if good, and by a line of darkness or even blackness, if bad. The radiant lines are gathered up by guardian spirits of the individual and woven into a crown." And that's what some of her really abstract drawings are trying to represent. We perhaps, to conclude, approach these practices of spirit drawing in private languages and complex theoretical architectures, rather like perhaps outsider art. And outsider art has had a lot of crossover with spiritualist practice throughout the 20th century. Yet the recovery of Houghton's work, and I think this was a really significant moment, the recent exhibition at the Courtauld in 2016 suggests that a reassessment of this kind of art is ongoing. Perhaps what has been so outre about these works is not the embarrassing beliefs that drive them, but an objection to the colours of the sacred they reveal. Like the project of the colour of anxiety, the dissonant and dissident roles of colour in late Victorian unorthodox and heterodox belief might also be worthy of reassessment. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Roger, for that wonderful talk. And I think you've just raised so many different thoughts and ideas. And I first of all just like to say it's really nice to actually that you brought in the kind of moving into the 20th century and those ideas, you know, theosophy and Mondrian, etc. And actually one thing, the exhibition has a kind of timeline of 1850 to 1900, but I think that Nicola and Adrian would agree with me that actually it would have been really nice to have extended the exhibition further in terms of going into the 20th century, but obviously we had to have some limitations as one does. And the other thing I mean, before I get on to, had some great questions in the chat. I think one thing I also wanted to mention was I was really interested in what you talked about the idea of women and colour, and one of the things that the exhibition has focused on, which is really was not something that was really set out at the beginning, and I think we very much, as I said, when Nicola and Adrian were putting together their list, they noticed that there was this reoccurrence of images of women, and the fact that actually the exhibition is almost entirely focusing on images of women. And I just wondered if you might maybe just comment a bit about I liked your idea. You talked about women being colour and men being white, and the fact that we've in this exhibition we've got a lot of images of women in colour by men, and I just thought that's we've not really thought about that kind of gendering of colour, and I wondered, yeah, if you might possibly talk a bit more about that. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. Always the mute. Always the mute. Yes, thanks for that. That's really interesting. I mean, I think it is very it's compelling and kind of quite consistent. I think that and Michael Tausig does this kind of association, which is very Victorian association of if you have primitive peoples, so-called. That tends to be allied with children, and it also tends to be allied with women as kind of slightly lower down the evolutionary scale, although weirdly they can also be higher in refined nerves at the same time. Make up your mind. And that sort of sense of then the association of that with kind of bright colour as being somehow immature or not quite a point of civilized taste, and that therefore you're going to work through aesthetically, you're going to work through all of that kind of brash stuff before you get to the pure white of, you know, the heightened form of ideal kind of classical architecture, classical sculpture, I guess. So there's that sort of sense, I think, in which that's pretty consistent, and you do see that in lots of anthropological writings at the time. People go into even working class areas of London, anthropologists saying, you know, here you see bright colours, and, you know, people are interested in kind of bright ribbons and bright clothes in a way that is clearly supposed to be coded as being less civilized and less mature. So I think, and that's always gendered. It's always gendered by late Victorian anthropology, and therefore you see it also in aesthetics as well.
Thank you very much. Well, we've got lots of questions coming in to the chat. I will turn to some of them. And I think the first question question from our curator, Nicola Jennings, and she says, thank you so much, Roger, for a fascinating talk. It seems as though there were many parallels between what spiritualists were producing, the forms of Bézanne and Leibeta, ectoplasm, etc. Do we know whether any of them talked about or dabbled with sculpture? And it was something I was thinking, because I noticed actually when you showed all those, I mean, it was spirit drawings, and then the Kandinsky, Mondrian, or painting, and so I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, sure.
The sculptural context here.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And I'm kind of vaguely intimidated by this, but what I know from my colleagues who work on Vernon Lee. Vernon Lee was a really interesting kind of decadent writer, and she wrote ghost stories, but also wrote lots of art criticism as well. And she also got into this completely crazy theory about humming at sculptures, sort of singing at sculptures and doing all kinds of weird things in sculptural places. And I'm aware that my colleague Caroline Burdett has actually written on this quite extensively, and there's a group of people around the Victorian Journal, which comes out of my department, called 19, which is quite frequently focused in on issues around sculpture and sculptural through their interest in this. Hilary Fraser, of course, historian of art, but also of literature as well, very interested in this area. So they've been quite involved in reproducing the kind of weird psychical experiments that Vernon Lee got involved in, and she does cross over with quite a lot of the psychical researchers of the time. And she knew a lot of the same sort of people in London. And so that kind of link perhaps is something we could really sort of work into this whole vision as well, that sort of sense in which there is something about the spaces of the gallery and spaces of art that Vernon Lee was interested in, that you could begin to tie into these sorts of things. And then there are kind of particular artists and actually I'm trying to think hard of sculptors, but artists definitely who kind of on the quiet side were very involved in spiritualist movement, and very kind of involved in trying to portray that sort of connection. People like James Tissot, the painter, who's very kind of famous, but actually he's discussed by friends in the minutes of the Ghost Club as continuing to model his favorite model art long after she died, because she would just like reappear essentially in the studio. And he never talked about that publicly, but nevertheless that was involved. And people like John Varley Jr., the painter, was one of those who Bézanne and Leibeta asked to kind of reproduce this, and he was also a member of the Ghost Club and a spiritualist and a theosophist as well. So there are lots of people, I think, who are interested in these sorts of areas, which kind of cross over in more or less kind of public ways.
Thank you. I've got a few more questions. I think we've got time for a few more before we end. We've got a question. What are your thoughts about the colour black, picturing the darkness of the soul, the occult, the darkness of the camera obscura, as opposed to the white, divine or heavenly light?
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of classic coding, isn't it? And very kind of strong in the 19th century as well. So the occasional Satanist, there aren't that many Satanists, it's a bit annoying really, but the occasional Satanists are very focused in on the inversion, obviously, between black and white. So this kind of movement from inverting all of the colors of heaven with the colors of hell, and that can be either red but increasingly black, and black masses and black magic were very kind of strongly imagined in the late 19th century. So someone like the decadent Huysmans, who was writing about black magic in Paris, in his book Down Below, Là-bas, is all about the kind of black magic rituals taking place in that. Although that's a very religious book, it's about kind of about converting out of that into something safer and less decadent. Whereas, someone like Aleister Crowley is very much into these very bright, fierce kind of colours. He's somebody else you could also figure, although he was considered and named himself the Antichrist. Actually, all of his kind of colour coding was from ritual magic. So those colours had very significant ritual significance. So, reds and purples and those sorts of colours, I think, were much more involved in what you might think of as the most famous black magician of the time, black magic magician.
Absolutely. We've got a couple more questions thinking about kind of issues of race and gender. First of all, the question of were more women brought into spiritualism than men, and the question of were all mediums white people, or were
yeah, that's a really good question. Really good question. So what I didn't have time to do was to talk actually about the interesting effects. So women were felt to be, as I was saying, more sensitive. So they were often given the place, actually one of the rare public places where women could kind of perform and speak and have some kind of control was in the seance. And there's a truckload of scholarship by very brilliant women scholars who've written on this. But Alex Owen, The Darkened Room, is probably the best place to go for this kind of stuff. But there are hundreds of others that have happened since. So it's very kind of Christine Ferguson, who works at Stirling, has written very well, very brilliantly about this area as well. Marlena Tromp, lots of people lots of women scholars who've written on this. So yes, it is a kind of privileged space. But actually, what's really weird also is that so if you're a medium, you quite often have control, which means that you go into a trance state, and then your first point of contact is a control who then goes and gets all of the other spirits for you. That control is quite often of a different race. So there's this really weird kind of transition where you quite often have I'd say a very demure middle-class white woman whose control might be in America, a Native American figure. In England, quite often a black figure, or a figure who's very displaced in terms of race. And that's obviously a kind of way of staging maximum difference. You're kind of saying, this is not me, that I have become something other in this kind of trance state. But the way that race is used in that way is really quite intriguing. There was a very famous medium called Helen Smith, who claimed to be, she was partly kind of life regression stuff. So she claimed to be a princess from India and could write in, Indian script, which was so convincing to many people that they actually took it to Ferdinand de Saussure, the most famous linguist at the time, and he said, yeah, that's probably a native language, yeah. And then she claimed she was a princess actually not from India, but from Mars, and started writing Martian. And de Saussure also said, yeah, that's probably Martian as well, because it's a consistent internal language. She was also a great painter, so she painted some of her visions as well. So there's lots of kind of weird things going on with alterity, with difference. You have male circles with a female medium who's given power, and then the female medium quite often inverts again into, either a differently raced or a differently gendered figure within the middle of that circle in order to emphasize the kind of difference, the unworldliness of what's going on. So there's lots of dynamics that are really interesting there.
We've actually just had a comment in the chat who mentioned Pamela Coleman Smith, who designed the tarot deck, was also a woman of color.
Absolutely. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you do kind of find that, and obviously the whole kind of conjure woman tradition in America was also something that kind of was bumping along into this as well. And once you get into the world of the largely invented kind of version of voodoo, then that sort of sense of the kind of exotic strangeness of that, which was really amped up by writers like Lafcadio Hearn, who kind of hung out with the so-called voodoo queen of New Orleans. He was the one who sort of invented that very exotic, weird, kind of highly coloured, symbolic world of the voodoo ritual. Not to say it didn't take place, but this is the kind of, you know, the consumed version of it. So there are lots of these elements kind of coming in from everywhere. And Mary Kingsley, very famous anthropologist in the late 19th century, one of the few women anthropologists, as soon as her miserable father died, she went to West Africa as a field worker anthropologist, believed firmly that she could telepathically communicate with the natives, and also, that, as she put it, could think in black, because she was a woman, because she had more kind of sensitivity, and that actually you needed more women in the anthropological field than you did men, because they had less sensitivity. They couldn't kind of connect in the same sort of way. So yeah, lots of stuff to do with race.
I was actually just thinking, thinking, and also, you kind of in the 19th century, I think, just one example that comes to mind is Jane Eyre and the gypsy woman who is the fortune teller, and again this kind of idea of sort of otherness,
Exactly.
race, coming in there as being a sort of example in Victorian literature.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think just in a nice sort of way to round it off, we've got one final question which asks, can you recommend any contemporary artists working within spiritualism? Should be a nice sort of...
Oh yeah, I think so. Let me just put the name down, because there's a really interesting, there are lots of people who work on this, and lots of people who work on it in a kind of, way that's difficult to gauge their levels of irony. Whether they're kind of straight or not. And I loved seeing Shannon Taggart, the photographer, kind of deliver what is completely straight, kind of presentation on her work. And you kind of don't ask the question, but are you you just can't, it's not there. The other person I would recommend is Suzanne Treister, who is kind of working in the outsider art kind of tradition. She's also designed tarot decks, and she works on the kind of edges of conspiracy theory and so on, but she's very interested in spiritualism. She has a couple of pieces in the current horror show, which is on down at Somerset House in London, if you can get to that. I think it's still open, I'm not sure. So Suzanne Treister, and then also, kind of going back a bit, but Susan Hillier was someone who was also very interested in this kind of stuff. And all of them are connected by my colleague who writes so brilliant about this, Marina Warner. So she wrote a book called Phantasmagoria, which kind of connects together lots and lots of these things. But yeah, those are some names, and there is kind of loads of there's loads of stuff, interesting folk horror, folk kind of art stuff at the moment, which is really pulling in that kind of marginal or outlier kind of art, outsider art, changing status all the time. I think is really interesting area to investigate as well.
Fantastic. Well, I think we've run over. I feel like we can continue these conversations all evening. But for the sake, I will draw the event to a close. So Roger, just want to say a huge thank you once again for your lecture, and just for these really interesting discussions that we've begun, and look forward to continuing them in further form. And I also want to say a big thank you to my colleagues Kirsty Gregory and Adam Burntown for ensuring the smooth technical running tonight.
Absolutely.
And finally, a thank you to everyone who's tuned in, and for your contributions and questions that's made this so fruitful discussions. So just to reiterate that next week is very sadly the final week of the exhibition The Colour of Anxiety at the Institute. So if you've not had a chance yet to visit, do come and don't miss out on the last chance to see the exhibition. And it's also the last event in the series around the exhibition, but you can catch up with the previous online research events in the series on our Institute and YouTube channel. I think there was a link went in the chat for that. So our previous events in the series with Professor David J. Getzi and Professor Jennifer DeVere Brody and Adrian Childs are now available to watch online. In the meantime, though, thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Good night.
Thank you everyone for coming. It's been great.
Thank you.